morning. I'm Sean Harrison with Soilborn Farms. Today we're going to be preparing a garden bed, and I'm going to give you an idea of how that works. This is part of a series that we call Grow Your Groceries, because what we're really all about is trying to get all of you excited and prepared and with all the skills you need to succeed in growing your own food at home. Preparing a garden bed is really one of the most important things. You can do it right and you can do it not so right. But today we're going to kind of go over the basics from soil moisture, assessing good soil moisture before we dig, getting the weeds out of the bed, and adding a little bit of fertility, and then making our final bed for planting. So very first thing though, and this is super important, is that we're going to assess soil moisture. So your soil can either be too dry or too wet, and this is different based on the different soils that you have. A lot of people in Sacramento, in our community, have soil that has a lot more clay in it. And so if it's really wet, it'll stick together. And if it's really dry, it'll be super powdery. We're trying to find something right in the middle, where if I dig down just a little bit, I can grab a little bit of soil and kind of squeeze it. And if it is super powdery, where I could blow it out of my hand, that's too dry. But if I squeeze it and it sticks together and I can't break it apart, then it's too wet. So you kind of have to get the moisture right. If it's too dry, I'm going to put a sprinkler on it, or I'm going to put some irrigation tubes like this, water it again, wait, come back. I want to get it to the point where it's that nice crumbly but not powdery. And we have slightly too dry on the surface. Right here is actually perfect because that's where the irrigation line was. But over in this area it's a little bit dry, but right under the surface it's just perfect. So it's okay to dig right now. We've assessed, once you've assessed soil moisture, then you're really trying to assess what is your weed conditions in the bed. And this is actually really important. There's some stuff in here, in fact, there's stuff that's just popping up. This is actually a sunflower that you might decide to keep. We're going to clear this whole bed. But again, the really thing to know is to start to get to know your weeds, because some of these are what we would consider an annual weed, which is going to produce a seed, and then that's how it's reproducing itself. But there are some weeds that are actually not, they're perennials, which means they grow differently than an annual, and they have roots in the ground that we need to get out of the soil, because that's really how they reproduce themselves. So we can come through with the annual stuff and just kind of skim them off the surface, but with the weeds that are a little bit more problematic, we're actually going to dig them out. We have one called bindweed, which is this really viney, white flowered, actually kind of pretty, but it really can take over your garden. And so I'm going to take my garden fork and I'm just going to try to pop that weed out as deeply as I can and get as much of that root as I can out. In this case, there's a little bit of a patch of it in this area. You may have other problem weeds in your garden, things like Bermuda grass. That's another one that you got to get the roots out with. There's another thing called nut sedge. You got to get the roots out with that, because all those little roots are going to turn into new plants. The bindweed actually goes really deep, and so I'm just trying to get as much of that root energy out so that it doesn't regrow and we can get rid of it. You all will have different weeds in your gardens, but if you can get the roots out of the perennials, and then you can either hand weed or you can use a little tool. This is a hula hoe, has a little blade, and it kind of works in this fashion where you can just take it and skim the surface of the soil. And this is actually really important because, if I don't have problem weeds, I don't really want to I want to disturb the soil as little as possible. So I'm just going to kind of, skim this off the surface here and get a nice clean bed. So we've gotten rid of the annual weeds, and then we've gotten rid of the perennial weeds. we have here is we've got a blank bed. Now, if you've got a really bad weed problem in your yard, it's going to go a little bit more difficult than this. You're going to have to really take the time to get those weeds out, right? You've got your moisture right. So this is kind of like our raw bed. It's clear of the weeds. I've got the annual weeds out. I've got the perennial weeds out. What I like to do next is actually add our fertility to the surface. In our case, we use a really good compost. You can get good bagged compost at the garden store. Just make sure it doesn't have any kind of fir barks in it, because those can actually prevent seeds from germinating. So a good real compost, right? Good decomposed compost. Worm castings is one of the best things that you can add in. So we're going to add a little bit of compost to the surface, and then we're going to dig the bed. And the reason why I do the compost first is, well, I might as well put it on, and then when I'm digging the bed, it'll just naturally sort of be adding the compost in as I'm digging it. Compost is what we've got here. This is what you can get in good bagged form from your local garden store. We're going to begin to sell this here at Soilborn Farms as well. You really do want a good quality compost that's completely decomposed. So all this organic matter, this is all going to go into the soil. And actually what it's doing is it's feeding the biology in the soil. And then that biology is breaking down, chewing and decomposing all this remaining organic matter. And then they're making that available to the plants. So we want to feed the microorganisms and the big beetles and earthworms in the soil so they can get the stuff that they need, and then when they break it down, it gives the plants what they need. And then in the big picture, if the plants have what they need, right, nutrients and minerals, then when we eat that plant, we get what we need. So we're going to add a little bit of compost to the surface. If you had about a 10-foot bed, our beds are somewhere between around 30 inches wide, 24 to 30 inches wide. You would add about probably a 5-gallon or a half bag of compost within a 10 feet area. The measurement that I usually use is like a 5-gallon bucket. But I'll just kind of sprinkle this on the surface so you really can't see the bottom soil. It's going to kind of cover that nice and evenly. You really can't use too much compost as long as it's a good quality one. So you don't have to really sweat those details, but you definitely want to add compost every time you plant a new crop. So we've got our compost down, we've cleared our weeds, we've checked our moisture, we're ready to go. So now I'm just going to demonstrate just a little bit of the digging technique of the garden. Your goal over time, you'll find that as you get your garden beds in better condition each year, you're going to have to do less and less digging. And the ultimate goal is where you're really doing hardly any. You're just scratching the stuff off the surface, putting your compost down and planting right into it. You'll be amazed if you do this for a few years how your garden will respond. I have a digging fork. This is the tool that I like to use for digging my garden bed. And what it really does is I can kind of put it in there and really loosen up the soil. And then I'm going to pull it up and just do a little bit of loosening, really. Loosening, and if I've got big clods, I'm kind of breaking them up. The importance of this activity really is, yes, I'm mixing in the compost a little bit, but what I'm really doing is I'm just kind of loosening the soil. And this really helps with the plant roots to, the things you're going to plant in here really helps those roots to kind of grow down. It also allows oxygen and water to penetrate into the soil. And, you might find that you're having to dig a lot harder than this in your bed because you haven't grown in it before, but eventually it will look like this. The one thing I would like to demonstrate, so this is the incorrect technique, and I'm going to demonstrate it actually with a shovel. So a lot of people will dig their garden bed with a shovel, which you can do, but it's not the same kind of, it doesn't have the same benefit. A lot of people will invert their soil. So they'll dig down and they'll turn it over and then they'll kind of smash it apart. And you might have to do that a little bit, but it's the inversion, it's the turning over that we don't want to do. What we're really trying to do is loosen and then just kind of let the soil fall through the tines of the fork. And the reason for that is that there's different biology in the soil, and some of them live near the surface and some of them live down below. There's earthworms that are hiding in the cool soil. If I invert that, I'm bringing them all to the surface where they don't want to be. So we're trying to avoid that. So what I'm gonna finish digging this bed, and then we will finish it and get ready for planting. Starting to sweat here a little bit. What I'm doing right here is I'm actually just loosening up the edges too. One of my teachers said that if you take care of the edges, the middle will take care of itself. So this really, the idea behind that is really loosening up the soil all the way to the edge of the bed. You're creating a nice growing space for all of your plants all the way to the edge of the bed. And you can see I'm not turning the soil at all. I'm just forking into the soil and kind of popping it up just a little bit of this loosening action. And that's really gonna create a nice space for us to grow in. The next step is that I'm gonna take our rake, I'm gonna reform our bed and smooth it out. We've just raked the bed. We've got it kind of nice and even. This is actually a really important step if you're planting seeds directly in the soil. We want to try to get it as nice and flat as we can, particularly for the small seeded stuff. So if you're planting carrots, for example, or flowers, and you're planting the seed directly into the soil, those seeds are really small. So we want to have a nice flat surface so that when they germinate, when they start to grow, they're all coming up at the same time and they don't get buried too deep. But if you're planting a big seed like a corn or a melon, this is perfect. This is also perfect for planting if you're getting a 6-pack of plants or something from the garden center, or if you're getting them here from the farm, then this is a perfect bed for planting into that. One thing that you really need to avoid though at this stage, and I'm going to demonstrate this, so this is not correct, but you can imagine that we've got this beautiful bed and then I decide to step on it. Well, if you look at that, all that great work that we just did as far as aerating, loosening the soil has now been compacted with my footprint. So if you notice when I was working, I was always working on the edges and I wasn't stepping on the bed. That is really important. So because I can't stand looking at that, I'm gonna pop that up again, loosen it up a little bit, and your earthworms and your plants will love you for doing that. So we've got our bed that's ready for planting. If you're going to plant, something like a sunflower or a melon or a tomato, you would try to plant it along. In this case, we're using a drip tube. So whatever our water source is, we're going to plant it, those plants right along that edge, or we're going to plant those seeds right along that edge. If you don't have irrigation tubing and you're going to be watering by hand, with a watering can or a hose, then you just need to know where you planted your plants. So if you've planted the plant as a plant that's grown or it's a seed, you'll need to mark it so that when you go through to water them, you're watering in the correct location. if you follow these steps, right? Assess your moisture, add your food in, get rid of your weeds, aerate the soil, and kind of create a nice growing space where it's all loosened up, you'll have great success in your garden. How cool would it be if we could all grow our own food in our own backyards in the city where we live and work? We hope that you'll join Soilborn Farm in learning how to grow your own groceries. And moving forward, you should expect more classes and videos from us to show you how to do it.